Hi, we are back together again for lecture 4 or learning block 4 in this course on human sexuality. And this talk 4 is essentially about the 6 dimensions of human sexuality, but with the greater focus of this lecture on the stages of our development, of our psychosexual development. So just to briefly recap, in the first 3 lectures, I did an exercise in what we call sexual ethics, biblical or theological sexual ethics. And essentially, it involved 3 steps. First of all, what is the present condition of human sexuality in society today, which is a social analysis of human sexuality in all its expressions and from a biblical point of view in all its brokenness. Then the second step is what is the ideal, what ought to be in regard to human sexuality? What is the vision, the goal, the ideal of human sexuality? And from a theological point of view, that is God's intended purpose in giving us the gift of human sexuality as His differentiated image in creation as male and female, a complementary sexual pair, to be united in the covenant of marriage. So the creation design of human sexuality is the vision or the ideal to which God is restoring us. And then the third step is basically how do we be free or liberated from what is the real to what ought to be the ideal. And that involves redemption, salvation, and healing and transformation and building sexual character, where we ended up our last lecture in terms of the disciplines of chastity and also celibacy to grow sexual containment and restraint and to sublimate our sexuality for the good of other people and to honor God and to honor our bodies. So that brings us then to this next lecture of the 6 dimensions of human sexuality and the 4 stages in our psychosexual development. And just to say that I end up with a few characteristics on sexual wholeness and maturity, because that's actually what the journey, the human journey, being human, is all about, is sexual wholeness and maturity. And just to refer to the fact that in this particular lecture, I'm going to be drawing a lot on this book, which is called Your Sexual Self, Pathway to Authentic Intimacy, by 2 Catholic authors, Fran Ferder and John Hagel, psychologists and also biblical scholars. So I found this as a very helpful book. So just to start off with, then in this first segment, we will talk about the 6 dimensions and then stage 1 of prenatal sexual development and stage 2 of our child sexual gender development. So the goal is integration into sexual wholeness. That's the goal of the human journey from creation design. But as we said before, things can go wrong at various stages of our development and in various dimensions of our human sexuality. And so when things go wrong, there is damage, there is brokenness, and we have to work with that reality. So these 6 dimensions basically tell us that human sexuality is not just about the feelings we have in our body, it's not just about our genitals, it's not just about sexual intimacy per se, but actually it affects the whole of who we are, and the whole of who we are also affects our human sexuality. So there's a dynamic interrelatedness. But for the sake of understanding, we break it down into 6 dimensions, although in reality they are dynamically fluid and integrated and we experience them in all these dimensions. So there is the physical part, which is the most obvious, the physical dimension firstly. That's the biological, genetic, hormonal factors that influence our sexual awareness, our sexual sense of self, and our responses at all stages in our development and seasons of life. But then beyond the physical, there is the cognitive, the mental dimension of human sexuality. And that is about the accurate and adequate, age-appropriate sexual knowledge regarding positive perceptions of our bodies, and also reverence for ourselves and for others. So this is the whole mental understanding, knowledge side of human sexuality. And then there is the emotional side, that's being at home in our bodies and our sense of self, and aware and comfortable with sexual feelings and not driven by them, but actually having healthy respectful feelings in ourselves and towards others regarding human sexuality, our sexuality and their sexuality. There is the social dimension, which flows naturally from the emotional dimension, the feelings part. The social is the relating part, and that is relating in healthy, unconscious ways, with the ability just to be yourself and to self-disclose and to sustain friendships and psycho-emotional intimacy. When we use the word intimacy, we immediately in the Western world think of sexual intimacy, but intimacy is psychological, is emotional, is relational. It's not just genital. And so sexual ethicists talk about genital sexuality and psychosocial sexuality, and both have to do with dimensions of human intimacy with other human beings, genital intimacy, as well as psycho-emotional warmth of affection and closeness through self-disclosure. And that is the gift we can give to one another in our social sexuality. There is also, number 5, morality, or the moral dimension, and that is valuing the attitudes and actions that we need for ongoing sexual integration, to express our sexuality in faithful, healthy, and other enriching ways. In other words, it really has to do with behaviors in keeping with God's creation design, in honoring God, ourselves, and other people. So values, morality is very important to boundary and express our human sexuality in God-given ways and healthy ways for the good of humanity. And then lastly, there is the spiritual dimension of human sexuality. Some people think that spirituality and sexuality are like opposites. No, they ought to be friends and not enemies. They meet in the deepest part of our human being. So the spiritual dimension is affirming the presence of God and the sacred in our sexual feelings and expressions. Recognizing that our sexuality and spirituality are not enemies, but ought to be friends. Because often our sexuality makes us feel guilty and even full of shame because of its drivenness, etc., and whatever messages we've received as we grew up, and therefore it is kind of an enemy to our spirituality. But bringing all sexual awareness into the light of God's presence and celebrating it as God's good gift to us, and surrendering it to God in trust that He will meet our sexual needs and help us in our sexual growth. That is actually the positive spiritual side of our human sexuality. So these 6 dimensions operate at each of the 4 stages of our psychosexual development. So the 4 stages are the prenatal, in other words, in our mother's womb, the beginning of our formation as a human person, not just as an embryo. And then in childhood, the 2nd stage, then in adolescence, the 3rd stage, and then in adulthood, the 4th stage. And there is a linear process of growth in our sexual development through these 4 stages, but also there's a cyclical pattern of turning back. So each stage, there is an awakening to our sexuality, then there's an exploring of our sexuality, then there's a relating and expressing of our sexuality, and then again an awakening, exploring, and then a relating or expressing at each of the 4 stages of prenatal, childhood, adolescence, and adulthood. So the other point to remember is that at any of these stages of development, we can be wounded, we can experience trauma, there is broken creation that also is with us because of Adam and Eve's fall into sin. And so when at any of these stages of our psychosexual development and growth towards wholeness and integration and maturity, if we are broken or traumatized or damaged or wounded at any of these stages, we can become fixated. That's what's the word that psychologists use, and arrested in our sexual development at that stage. And healing often requires going back to that age and stage of our sexual development to relive the trauma and receive healing from past hurts and memories that then can help us continue our growth towards wholeness and towards maturity. So then let me introduce the stages by talking about the prenatal stage, the first stage. And I use the text from Psalm 139 where David says, God, you created my innermost being. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you because I'm fearfully and wonderfully made. Your eyes saw my unformed body, and you wove me together in the depths. I mean, David's description of being in the womb is absolutely beautiful. This is the mystery of God's creation. So in that stage in utero, in the womb, we are unaware of our body selves, but there is also the beginning of body experience. And research shows that even in the womb, there is imagery of rhythmic sexual responses within the womb. So there are much more research is being done in this area, but there are prenatal influences in the womb can affect our sexual development later in adult life. So it's the nature-nurture debate. How much of it is determined by our nature, our biology, and how much is determined later by our nurture, our psychosocialization. But just to say that when it comes to genetics, once again, we are born the way we are born, but intersex can be a chromosomal anomaly in our different presentations of our human sexuality that needs a multidisciplinary team to intervene and work with that. But epigenetics, outside influencing factors, can affect our formation in the womb in various ways that can later come out in adulthood in terms of presenting problems that need to be then worked with in a healthy and constructive way. So I'm going to pause here because I've used up my time for the first segment, and we will then engage in the second segment. Thank you. So segment 2 of our lecture 4 has to, we will be looking at together the second stage in our psychosexual development, that is childhood. And childhood has 3 phases: from birth to being a toddler, that is the stage of sexual unawareness. Then from toddler to early preschool, that's the stage of sexual awakening. And then from preschool to puberty, and that's the stage of psychosexual socialization, the beginning of relating to others. The third stage of adolescent sexual development also has got 3 phases, and that's from puberty to early teens, and that is about the beginnings of sexual fantasy. The second phase is in our mid-teens, which is about sexual preoccupation. And then the third phase is our late teens into early adulthood, which is learning relational exploration in our human sexuality. So I've given you this up front as a picture of what we do in this segment. First of all then, the childhood stage. And I use a text here. In the prenatal, I used Psalm 139. Here I use Luke chapter 18, verse 15 to 16 of what these folk call the sacred touch in our sexual development. So people were bringing their infants to Jesus, the Rabbi Jesus, that he might touch them. And the word touch is hapto, which is not just touch, but is holding, hugging, laying on hands, embracing. When the disciples saw it, they sternly ordered the parents not to do it. But Jesus called for them and said, "Let the little children come to me, and do not stop them, because it is to such as these that the kingdom of God belongs." So Jesus embraced the little children and affirmed them in their body selves, affirmed them in their differentiated human sexuality, either male or female. So phase one in childhood development is from the birth to toddler stage, 1 to 2, 3 years old, and that is the stage of sexual unawareness. And that essentially has to do with our first sense of sexual identity when we are born, where the parents say it is a boy or it is a girl. And these days we know in the womb through the sonogram. Often if the parents want to know, then the doctor tells them it's a boy or a girl. But it's first, it's a boy or it's a girl. And then it's personal identity. So it's first sexual identity, then personal identity. And the personal identity is then the naming of the child, either a boy's name or a girl's name. But then in that stage, there is the unaware sexual experiencing of body sensations, but with slow but sure growing cognitive or mental awareness. And it happens through mom and dad. At the beginning of that stage, the differentiation starts seeping in between mom and dad, and it's the beginning of not only sexual but gender differentiation and gender identity. And it is at this stage of development that if there is trauma or woundedness or pain or interference of whatever sort, or even lack of a father in the early developmental stage, or the lack of a mother in the early developmental stage, then in adulthood, that arrested sexual development in the very early childhood stage can present as adults would then tend to be asexual, where their interest, and I'm reading here actually directly from this book, Your Sexual Self, their interest in sexual thoughts, fantasies, feelings or behaviors is limited or even absent. And if we're wounded in that stage of development, we also may appear infantile or naive regarding sex and sexuality. And they often have difficulty feeling their feelings in other areas of life. And so they tend to be dependent on others for nurture. So that in adult life, often the wounding in early childhood sexuality presents itself in those ways. So the second stage of childhood development is from toddler to early preschool. That's probably like 3 years old to 5 years old or 6 years old. And that is the stage of sexual awakening. And there early self-pleasuring begins, the bodily sensations of pleasure, and it leads often to normal childhood sex play, where there is body and psychic consciousness, where boundaries then start developing and need to be slowly but surely put in place. But it also has to do with trusting the affirming touch and presence of caregivers, your mom and your dad, or other caregivers, that the affirmation of your body by touching and hugging and holding and caring for you is affirming and not interfering. and not reprimanding. It leads to body acceptance and comfort with your body self. And it also it's the beginning of language acquisition and actual gender identity formation. So that is a very important stage from toddler to early preschool. And once again, if there is hurt or trauma or molestation that takes place, or imposition of guilt by wrong reprimand of early childhood sexual feelings and body touch, then it can damage and arrest us in our development, and we become fixated at that level in our sexual development. And the way it presents itself in adult life is that adults fixated here tend to behave inappropriately regarding sex. They are sexually awake but have not adequately socialized their heightened sexual interests. They also tend to be focused on themselves and may be attention-seeking, often look for approval, and are easily threatened by others. Their relationships tend to be short-term and lacking in depth, and there is some evidence that adults who are more sexually interested in children than in adults are fixated at this stage of development and need healing from their hurt and trauma in the stage of preschool to puberty, at least toddler to early preschool development. The third phase of childhood sexual development is from preschool to puberty. So that's about 5, 6 years old, going through to 11, 12 years old, 13 years old. And that's a stage of psychosocial, at least psychosexual socialization. So it's not just biological sexual development, it's the beginning, it's the gender identity formation, but the way it relates in terms of my socialization and my experience of myself with others that are like me and also different to me. So this is the stage of bondedness with caregivers, especially with mom and dad, and early socialization, where we begin to differentiate ourselves as a separate person from mom and dad, and I identify either with my dad more as a boy or with my mom more, and I start to understand I am like my mother because I'm a girl, and I am like my father because I'm like a boy. And once again, the absence of fathers or the absence of mothers and all the permutations of brokenness in the home can lead to a lot of psycho, emotional, and even subconscious damage at that stage. But it should develop healthy self-awareness in our nakedness, so that we can know and accept our private parts without any sense of guilt and shame. But if parents wrongly correct their children in terms of self-touch, which is natural and normal, then it imposes guilt on the child, and then they experience their nakedness and their genitals with guilt and shame, and that's the beginning of damage in our sexual selves. But at that stage, from preschool to puberty, there's also the search for connection and hormones. The socio-sexual play as a rehearsal for adult love. But obviously adults must guide when that happens, put in conditions, essential conditions for that to happen, that it is not wrong in terms of bullying or exploitation or inappropriate. So as Jesus says, do not hinder the children to come to me. Don't reject them, don't shame them, but hug them, hold them, affirm them, and talk with them and guide them through their development of their sense of sexual self in a healthy way, so that they grow through that period. But of course, if damage does happen in that period of preschool to puberty, when you're a boy or a girl, then it presents in adult life often with a secret sexual self, whereby we think, feel, and act sexual, but are afraid to show it or even to talk about it. They often then have normal sexual feelings and fantasies, but lacking adequate sexual information and too afraid to seek it directly. So they may not know what is normal or what is not normal. And outwardly, they may be very judgmental about the sexual behaviors of other people if they are damaged at that stage. And also, they may be ultra private about themselves in a wrong way and unable to be self-disclosing and spontaneous and at ease in human relationships. Adults may obtain vicarious sexual enjoyment via romance novels, soap operas, and via sexually explicit movies and material if they are arrested at that stage of their sexual development from preschool to puberty. And also individuals who have problems with compulsive masturbation and who use pornography as a primary form of sexual gratification are fixated at this stage of their development because of shame, because of guilt, because of inadequacy, because in terms of, as a boy, their father was not present to affirm their developing sexuality and help them in the journey from boyhood to manhood, to adolescence, because that does not happen automatically. And likewise with girls in terms of their mother's affirmation and father's affirmation. So a lot can happen in that stage that can traumatize or damage or wound and give wrong messages that can fixate us in our development at that stage. So then when it comes to adolescence, stage 3, it also has 3 phases, and this has to do with growth into adulthood from about 11, 12 years old or 13 on to 20, 21 years old. And the text that I use here is Luke 2. Jesus grew in wisdom and in stature, in grace and favor with God and others. So we too are designed by God to grow in stature, in wisdom, in our biological selves, our gender selves, in favor with God and with other people. So the first phase of adolescence is from puberty and early teens. 11, 12, 13, 14 years old, which is sexual fantasizing. So there the hormones kick in, the body starts changing, and there is natural positive imagination or just natural spontaneous fantasy, which actually is a kind of an innate instinctive rehearsal for future love relationships. And it has to do with sexual feelings that begin to be attached to persons. But is also equally the stage of developing self-autonomy and learning what restraint and awareness actually means in relation to your body self and your friends and your peers, whether it's boys or girls that are around you and that you socialize with. So it has to do essentially with the early development of sexual character. In other words, it raises the issue of fantasy and sexual awareness and morality in terms of core values and beliefs around God's design. And this is where, once again, parents need to be really involved in a sensitive, important way with the development of adolescence to guide children both in terms of spirituality and values and natural biology and socialization for their own sexual health and the health of others. So having that talk at a very early stage in adolescence with the children to explain to them what will happen and is happening and in their bodies, so that the child is able to work well with it. And it's the beginning to differentiate between lust and love, that the gift of human sexuality that's developing in me, I can be driven by these instincts and feelings and fantasies that then becomes lust, whereby I use others to pleasure myself and satisfy myself, as opposed to learning that these developing feelings and fantasies is a gift from God to learn to love others by honoring them and honoring myself in ways that is as God has designed for us, for their good and for my good, to celebrate this gift. So the second, if a child is then arrested or damaged at that stage in their sexual development, early adolescence, adults then become limited. They limit their sexuality to the realm of fantasy, and they derive more enjoyment from dreams than actually from the reality of sexual engagement itself. And they idealize relationships, so they are usually disappointed in real life relationships, and no one actually meets their expectations. And so jealousies, resentments and conflicts tend to characterize their relationships in adult life. Those adults that are arrested in their sexual development at adolescence. The second phase of adolescence is the sexual preoccupation, which is the mid-teens. So probably 13, 14 years old or whatever, through to 18 years old, 17, 18 or 16 years old is sexual preoccupation. And it's the stage where we call it hormones on feet, where sexual fantasy and pleasuring develops with the preoccupation of yourself and also of your peers, with all the cultural, social pressure of your peers that come upon you. And that's the stage where you settle you finally do settle your identity in terms of your sexual self and your gender self, which in postmodern ideology is separated. That I can be in my body, a boy, a male, a teenage male, but I can decide that in my gender self, I am female, or I am androgynous, or I am this, that, or the next thing, whatever. But biblically and also biologically, we actually are integrated human beings, where my biological male body integrates into the development of my gender sense of self, where I am a boy becoming a man who is developing my masculinity into healthy manhood. Then the next phase is the late teens to early adulthood, which is the relational exploration phase. That has to do with infatuation, romantic relationships, and it still is the preoccupation with self, and there is a normal narcissism where you're preoccupied with yourself and your sexuality and awareness, but also there's unhealthy narcissism where you become fixated on your sexual self and my needs and my pleasure, which then leads to a drivenness, which becomes lust and brokenness and damage. But there is the need at that stage for healthy group interaction and friendships, and the beginning of falling in love, which goes beyond infatuation, and it leads to the levels of physical sexual engagement with boundaries and containment and ethics and character that is involved. And so it goes back to the previous lecture of helping teenagers to understand the practice of chastity, the practice of celibacy, the practice of restraint, and disciplining this energy, this fiery energy within their bodies, within their emotions, for health's sake, and not to indulge it, and it begins to drive one. So just to finish off then, the damage, when people are damaged at this stage in their sexual development, in the late teens and early adolescence, adults then usually are superficial in their relationships, with often the fear of being rejected. So they tend to be people pleasers and easily give themselves sexually just to please the other one in the hope that they will be loved, because they fear rejection. And they also generally are very sensitive to others' reactions to them, overly sensitive, and often need more affirmation, support, and attention in their adult life. And celibates who are fixated at this point at this stage of development tend to feel more comfortable with many friends and are hesitant to become invested in single close relationships. They struggle with commitment in monogamous relationship. And this can lead both to a scattered feeling as well as to love them and to leave them kind of pattern or behavior. And lastly, adults fixated here still tend to make relational decisions based on what is best for me and what actually works for me, not for the other person per se. So that then brings us to the end of the second segment. Thank you. Okay, we're on the third segment of lecture 4, and here I deal with stage 4 in our psychosexual development. So from prenatal to childhood to adolescence and then to adulthood. And here there are 3 phases again. Early adulthood has to do with our psychosexual, the mutuality, engaging in mutuality of psychosexual experience. And the second phase is the mid-adulthood, which is ongoing integration of our human sexuality into sexual character and wholeness. And the third stage is mature adulthood, which is psychosexual maturity. And I'll end this segment with just some qualities or marks of sexual maturity. So adulthood, I just use the text from Romans chapter 8 verse 19, which speaks about coming into our own in terms of our humanity, being human as a sexual being. And Paul says in Romans chapter 8 verse 19, the whole of creation waits with eager expectation or eager longing to see the revealing of the sons and daughters of God. So it's a remarkable phrase where Paul is saying that creation has been subjected to a curse, brokenness, and is longing for its own liberation. But the earth will be liberated into new creation first when human beings come into their own in new creation. And when that happens in our resurrection bodies, ultimately, then creation will be liberated. So there's this longing to see humanity as God intended humanity to be. And here in reference obviously to our sexual selves. So early adulthood, which is again probably 19, 20, going through to 25, 28, which is psychosexual, our mutuality, the mutuality of our psychosexual selves. Here is where sexuality, we learn that sexuality is the fiery gift of God's love and relationships, for commitment, for belonging, and for enjoyment, and for monogamy, for lifelong love and commitment, which leads to marriage. And it's the movement from being preoccupied with ourselves to becoming totally aware of the mutuality of human sexuality, whereby we learn to love and honor and commit to the other in sexual integrity and sexual belonging and fulfillment. So that's the stage of psycho-emotional intimacy in our social sexuality, for health and goodness, for intimacy, and not to be driven by the need for genital fulfillment and genital intimacy, which we can call genital sexuality. And of course the danger here is that people get fixated again on the genitalization of our sexuality, and the awareness again of the genital obsession, where we objectify the other as a means to pleasure ourselves. So growth in accurate self-knowledge leads to interpersonal sensitivity and empathy, which then leads to trust and self-disclosure, where we can be spontaneous and authentically ourselves and relate equally in mutuality with the other in a healthy sexual way, and not lust the other person. What I've just described is loving the other person in our sexual selves, as opposed to lusting the other person through our sexual selves. If one is damaged in this stage of our development, in terms of psychosexual mutuality, then adults later these adults are able to sustain healthy mutual friendships, but they may tend to limit themselves to what feels safe, and they may be protective about their own selves. They may fear taking risks, standing alone, or tolerating normal relational tensions for long periods of time, and therefore ongoing long-term monogamous relationships sometimes is difficult for people who are arrested or damaged at that stage. While generally healthy, these adults may be hesitant to engage in deeper, more intimate, affectionate, and vulnerable relationships, if such relationships feel threatening in any way. Obviously, then one needs healing at that stage of development. So the next stage in adulthood is mid-adulthood, from about 28 or 30 through to 40, 45, which is all about ongoing integration of our human sexuality into wholeness and character. So this is the unfinished business of psychosexual development, as the ongoing journey of healing wounds from the past, damage, hurt, trauma, the misinformation that we get from the past, the guilt and the shame often associated with our sexuality, and learning to generally integrate our body, soul, and spirit into healthy human sexual wholeness. So I spoke about the 6 dimensions of sexuality, and it's integrating all of them into healthy, whole human sexuality. And it's a matter of then processing and dealing with the past in terms of the wounds that we carry, the wrong messages that we receive, the misinformation, and working at integrating and healing towards wholeness. And the last stage, mature adulthood, which is really that's about psychosexual maturity, and that's in the second half of our lives, moving into our 50s and 60s and 70s. And that really is the journey of deepening personal awareness with a more accurate self-knowledge, where our blind selves have been revealed, and we faced ourselves and our past, and we've worked and integrated into healthy self-knowledge. And then we are fully at home in our bodies, in our sexual selves, without guilt or shame. And in a sense, we come full circle back to the beginning of a new innocence, but now it's an informed, healthy innocence to be our sexual selves. And it's marked by compassion and wisdom, both compassion and wisdom about ourselves, but especially in relationship to other people in their sexual selves. And it transcends genital sexuality in pure love, in preparation for our death and the age to come, the resurrection of our bodies. So interestingly, the longer we journey in our sexual selves within marriage, especially in our commitment in a monogamous, faithful relationship, in our senior adulthood life, the awareness and predominance of genital intimacy falls away and is fulfilled in the true love of psychosexual intimacy, where we learn to transcend genital sexuality in true loving by giving genuine, deep intimacy and warmth and affirmation to other people. That actually completes them in their sense of self, and we are completed in our sense of self. And that is what we call sexuality becomes generative. It gives life. It's life-giving in its warmth, in its energy. That is true love, and it's the love that is wise. And it's the love that is deeply compassionate on the other person and on ourselves. So to close this segment and our lecture 4, a few qualities of healthy psychosexuality. Firstly, healthy psychosexuality is deeply linked to the ongoing practice both of celibacy as single people, abstaining from genital sexual engagement, honoring your body as sacred and holy, as belonging to God, and in marriage, chastity, the discipline of chastity. So single people exercise celibacy until they are married, and also as single people they exercise chastity. And people who are married are not celibate, obviously, because they engage in sexual intimacy on a regular basis, but they exercise the discipline of chastity for healthy, faithful, monogamous sexual intimacy within marriage. So what I spoke about in lecture 3 still is very important for our journey of developing sexual character towards sexual wholeness. And sexually mature people have done that and are able to do that, and it becomes their second nature. Healthy sense of self and healthy engagement and awareness of others with respect and dignity. So a mark of sexual maturity is accurate self-knowledge and self-containment as a sacred embodied self with real honor and dignity and respect for other people in their sacred body self, so that there is trust in relationship and you are trustworthy in the eyes of others sexually. And equally, you with others with you. Healthy and mature psychosexuality has to do with awareness of boundaries, implementing boundaries and upholding boundaries for the sake of sexual integrity and true love or pure love in the way that we relate to other people. And fourthly, it has to do with responsible freedom. Sexually mature people are responsibly free. You know, in the postmodern world, freedom is defined generally as free to choose what you want to choose and do your own thing. Then you are truly free. Free from religious guilt, from restraints of your parents' morality and other stuff. And it's the sexual revolution of the 60s to be free sex. And it's the present postmodern revolution of sexuality through technology where anything goes, that sex is just purely recreational. That is not freedom. That actually is the slavery of being lost. My wife and I were watching on Netflix the documentary called Liberated on they call it the second sexual revolution that's happening right now with the younger generation through technology. And it's not freedom, it's actually profoundly, I was struck at how profoundly lost 12-year-olds are sending images through the phone of their naked bodies to one another. Girls with girls, boys with girls, boys with boys, and just kissing and having recreational sex from early teenagehood as almost like a hobby. So it's a statement of how profoundly lost people are, and they think that they're free. They actually are enslaved to animal instincts, their sexual instincts, with a separation of all values, morality, spirituality. And they think that in their bodies biologically they are free to do whatever they want to do, and it doesn't affect their soul. Whereas their mind, their emotions and their will become enslaved to corrupted bodily appetites. That is slavery. So sexual maturity is to be responsibly free, which basically means that you are led by moral values with being spontaneous and warm and engaging in relationships, but that is morally pure and life-giving to the other person. And that leads me to the next characteristic, which is developing creativity. Sexually whole or mature people are truly creative in terms of a converging self-awareness with mature energy that is free to be life-giving and generative and creative in various ways. And lastly, mature psychosexuality is the capacity to be authentically intimate. And of course, as I said before, when we use the word intimate in the Western world, we think immediately of sex. And it's not. It's just a very small part of intimacy. To be truly intimate, there is mental intimacy, there is emotional intimacy. You call it psychosocial intimacy, whereby we can be a disclosing, open, free human being, transparent human being that gives that value and dignity in relationships of warmth and affection without genital, lustful awareness or intrusion. And that kind of relating, where we're able to be intimate with people, males with males, females with females, men with women, without any intrusion in a wrong way of genital sexuality. That is the gift we can give to one another. That is called love. The fiery energy of God's pure, passionate love that makes us feel one, that makes us feel loved, and enables us to love, that completes us in this oneness of being. That is the gift of intimacy that mature psychosexuality gives to the other as we engage with them. Thank you. We've come to the end of our lecture 4.